For more than half a century, one system quietly shaped the global economy. Not armies, not alliances, but oil. Since the 1970s, nearly every barrel of oil sold around the world has been priced in a single currency, the US dollar. This arrangement became known as the petrodollar system, and for decades it gave the United States extraordinary economic influence. If countries needed energy, they needed dollars, and if they needed dollars, they had to operate within the American financial system, trading through its banks, holding its currency, and investing in its markets. The result was a powerful economic cycle that reinforced American financial dominance across the world. But today something is beginning to change. A slow, subtle shift is taking place inside global energy markets. An alternative idea is emerging, a system where oil might no longer be traded in dollars, but in Chinese yuan. Some analysts call this potential shift the Petroyuan. And the most surprising part is why it's happening. This transformation is not being driven by academic theories or economic experiments. It is being pushed forward by wars, sanctions, and rising geopolitical tensions. From the conflict in Ukraine, to sanctions imposed on Iran, to escalating tensions in the Strait of Hormuz, each crisis is slowly pushing some countries to explore alternatives to the dollar. And as these pressures grow, the global energy system that once seemed permanent is beginning to face new questions. Is the world witnessing the early stages of a new financial order? Or is this simply a temporary reaction to geopolitical pressure? To understand that question, we first need to understand the system that built American economic power in the first place. The system that built American power. The petrodollar system did not emerge by accident. It was the result of a strategic agreement forged during one of the most turbulent moments in modern energy history. After the 1973 oil crisis, energy markets were thrown into chaos. Oil prices surged, global economies struggled, and energy security became one of the most important geopolitical concerns in the world. In response, the United States reached a strategic understanding with Saudi Arabia. The agreement was simple but incredibly powerful. Saudi Arabia would sell its oil exclusively in US dollars. In return, the United States would provide military protection and long-term political support. Over time, other oil exporting nations followed the same model. From the Middle East to Africa, from Russia to Latin America, oil became a dollar-denominated commodity. This created enormous global demand for the American currency. Countries began accumulating dollar reserves in order to buy energy. Oil exporting nations reinvested their profits into US financial markets. Banks, investment funds, and government bonds in the United States absorbed billions in global capital. And this cycle strengthened the dollar's role as the dominant currency of global trade. For decades, the system remained remarkably stable. But over time, geopolitics began to shift. New rivalries emerged, new economic powers rose, and the rules of global energy trade slowly began to evolve. The Ukraine war, and the first major shock to this system arrived in 2022. That year, Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The response from Western governments was swift and unprecedented. The United States and its allies launched one of the largest sanctions campaigns in modern history. Russian banks were cut off from key international financial networks. Access to the SWIFT payment system was restricted. Foreign assets were frozen, and Western nations began reducing their purchases of Russian energy. For Moscow, the implications were enormous. Oil and gas exports formed the backbone of the Russian economy. Without reliable access to the global dollar system, selling energy to international markets suddenly became far more complicated. But Russia soon found an alternative path. The answer came from the East, from China. For years, China had been working to expand the international use of its currency, the yuan, also known as the renminbi, and the disruption caused by sanctions created an opportunity to accelerate that ambition. The Ukraine war provided the perfect opportunity. Within months, energy trade between Russia and China began shifting toward local currencies. By 2023, large portions of Russian oil exports to China were being settled in yuan rather than dollars. Russian officials confirmed that energy trade between the two countries increasingly used yuan and rubles instead of Western currencies. The scale was enormous. China had already become one of Russia's biggest energy customers, and this new payment structure allowed both countries to bypass Western sanctions. This was not just a trade adjustment. It was the beginning of a new financial channel outside the dollar system: Iran, the sanctions laboratory. But Russia was not the first country forced to experiment with alternatives to the dollar. That role belonged to Iran. For decades, Iran has faced heavy sanctions from the United States and its allies. These sanctions targeted Iran's banking sector and oil exports. The goal was to isolate Iran economically. Yet Iran remained one of the world's largest oil producers. And someone was still willing to buy: China. Over time, China became Iran's primary oil customer. By 2025, China was buying more than 80% of Iran's exported oil shipments, according to energy analytics data. Many of these transactions avoided the dollar system entirely. Instead, payments were made through alternative financial structures, sometimes in yuan, sometimes through barter agreements, sometimes through intermediary trading companies. Sanctions had created an unintended effect. They forced Iran and China to develop new financial channels, and those channels became the early foundations of the Petroyuan ecosystem. China's long strategy, China's interest in the yuan-based oil market, is not accidental. It is part of a much broader strategy. China is the world's largest importer of oil. Every year, it spends hundreds of billions of dollars on energy. Most of those purchases are still priced in dollars. This creates a vulnerability, because the dollar system is ultimately controlled by the United States. If geopolitical tensions rise, access to that system could be restricted. China's leadership understands this risk. That is why Beijing has spent years trying to internationalize the yuan. This strategy includes several major steps. First, China launched yuan-denominated oil futures markets in Shanghai. Second, China built cross-border payment systems that bypass Western financial networks. Third, China encouraged energy exporters to accept yuan payments. In some cases, this effort has already produced results. In October 2023, one of the first crude oil purchases was settled using China's digital yuan system, marking a milestone in energy trade experimentation. The message was clear: China wants the yuan to become a global energy currency. Saudi Arabia and the petrodollar question. If one country holds the key to the future of the petrodollar, it is Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is the world's largest oil exporter, and historically, it has been the central pillar of the dollar-based oil system. But relations between Washington and Riyadh have become more complicated in recent years. At the same time, China has emerged as Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer. This has opened the door to new conversations. In 2022, Saudi officials began discussing the possibility of pricing some oil sales to China in Chinese yuan instead of dollars. Although the change has not yet been fully implemented, even the discussion itself was significant. For the first time in decades, the possibility of non-dollar oil pricing was being considered by one of the architects of the petrodollar system. Meanwhile, energy trade between the two countries continues to grow. Saudi Arabia regularly ships millions of barrels of oil to Chinese refiners each month, and Chinese companies have invested billions of dollars in Saudi petrochemical projects. These growing ties are slowly reshaping the global energy landscape. Expanding the network, Russia and Iran are not the only countries involved in yuan-based energy trade. Other nations have begun experimenting with similar systems. For example, some Russian oil cargoes sold to Indian refiners have been paid for using Chinese yuan as part of complex financial arrangements. Meanwhile, China and Saudi Arabia signed a 50 billion yuan currency swap agreement in November 2023, designed to facilitate bilateral trade without relying on the dollar. These agreements do not replace the dollar overnight, but they create new financial pathways. Each new deal expands the ecosystem where energy can be traded outside traditional Western financial structures. The Strait of Hormuz factor. Now another geopolitical flashpoint could accelerate this trend. The Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula is one of the most critical energy choke points on Earth. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil supply passes through it. Any disruption in the strait can send shockwaves through global markets. Today, tensions between the United States and Iran are rising again. Military strikes, drone attacks, and regional confrontations have created fears of a wider conflict. In this environment, Iran has hinted at new strategies. One of them involves the possibility of linking oil shipments through the region to alternative payment systems. If Western sanctions intensify, Iran may push even more of its energy trade into yuan-based arrangements with China. For Beijing, this could further expand the Petroyuan network. For Washington, it could represent a long-term strategic challenge. The real limits of the Petroyuan. Despite all these developments, the Petroyuan is still far from replacing the dollar. The US currency remains dominant in global finance. Most international oil contracts are still priced in dollars. Global central banks hold the majority of their reserves in dollar assets. And American financial markets remain the deepest and most liquid in the world. Even countries experimenting with yuan energy trade often continue using dollars for other transactions. In reality, what we are witnessing is not a complete replacement. It is a gradual diversification. Countries under sanctions use yuan to bypass restrictions. Others explore it to reduce dependence on the US financial system. But the global economy has not yet shifted fully away from the dollar. A fragmented financial future. Instead of a single dominant currency, the future global system may become more fragmented. Several financial blocks could emerge, one centered around the dollar, another increasingly influenced by the yuan, others built around regional trade agreements and digital currencies. Wars and sanctions are accelerating this fragmentation. Every time a country is cut off from the Western financial system, it looks for alternatives. And every alternative strengthens the infrastructure of non-dollar trade. This dynamic is reshaping the global economic order, not through sudden revolution, but through slow structural change. The beginning or the illusion. So is the rise of the Petroyuan the beginning of a new era, or just a temporary reaction to geopolitical conflict? The answer may lie somewhere in between. The dollar still dominates global finance, but the monopoly it once held is no longer absolute. Sanctions, wars, and political rivalry are pushing countries to build alternative systems. Russia's oil trade with China, Iran's sanctions-driven exports, Saudi Arabia's currency discussions, and the growing strategic rivalry between Washington and Beijing. All of these forces are shaping a new economic battlefield. A battlefield where currencies compete for influence, and where oil, the most strategic commodity in the world, may determine the winner. The rise of the Petroyuan may not end the petrodollar tomorrow, but it signals something important. For the first time in half a century, the global oil trade is no longer tied to only one currency. And in geopolitics, that kind of shift can change everything.